my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I think it's probably best that we start off this episode with a couple of administrative notes, I guess you could say. There's a decent amount that happened the past 2 weeks, as you will probably likely know. And, actually, you might not know because nothing happened last week. So I guess first let's get into that. So last week, I guess I will just say that my code and personal projects were not the only things with bugs in them. So rather than you listening to me sound like absolute death and me hating myself the entire time I recorded it because how miserable I'd feel, I decided that I would just take the week off and just relax and try and recover. And while I might have lost some of my taste, I at least regained enough of it to know that TikTok is still garbage and Chinese spyware, so you shouldn't download it, so don't you worry. I didn't go completely off the deep end. But I guess in fairness, that is a pretty low bar I set for myself, but you know, it is what it is. And also, the other administrative note that I want to point out and apologize for is, I guess, 2 weeks ago at this point, if you went to listen to the latest episode of the Dark Assassins podcast on Saturday and you were greeted with the episode from the previous week, no, you were not imagining things. I done goofed on that one and messed up. As you'll see if you looked at the episode later on in the week or potentially even later that day, I kind of put a blurb on the first line there saying like, yep, we done goofed. We got the right one. So the actual episode that was supposed to air that week is up. So if you didn't listen to it because you thought it was a re-upload, that has also been fixed. So yeah, those are the big administrative notes that I wanted to hit on before we got into the podcast. But also, one thing I also do want to add about posting the wrong episode, I am honestly kind of surprised that it took me 65 episodes in order for that to happen. Because quite honestly, when I first heard a viewer reached out to me and were like, hey, did you mean to post last week's episode this week? And I was like, no. But the thing was, I honestly thought that this incident of me posting the wrong episode would have happened a lot sooner. I'm kind of surprised it took this long to actually happen. So hopefully it will be the last, but I am a human and I mess up quite a bit. So wouldn't surprise me if it happens again. So just like the listener did, if you notice that I done goof, please reach out to me and let me know. contact@darkassassinsinc.com. You can also, that's down in the show notes below. And you can also send topics and questions that you have also to that email address. So with all of that preamble aside, one other thing that I wanted to hit on real quick was I just wanted to give you guys, the listeners, my fellow assassins, a big thank you, because before things went downhill and my human operating system got a bug, I was looking at the analytics on the Spotify podcasters thing or whatever, where I basically do kind of where I upload my episodes and then push it, that pushes out to all the various podcast platforms. Anyway, I was looking at my analytics on there, and one thing that I was very surprised and impressed by was the fact that because of you guys sharing the podcast around all your friends and family, we're at the point now, just over a year away from the inception of the podcast, and we're at the point now where a single episode will get more listens on it according to these analytics, which in fairness, I have no idea how accurate they actually are. But anyway, according to them, we get more listeners per episode than we used to get in an entire month. So 4 episodes, which I think is pretty spectacular. And I just want to thank you guys so much for all the good work that you do, sharing the podcast around and spreading the word and growing our brotherhood of fellow assassins here. So I couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you very much. And now let's start off with this week's trivia question. So Python is a programming language that a lot of new developers learn as their first language, and is a programming language that a lot of people pick up because of its ease of use and versatility. So with that in mind, when was the 1.0 version of Python released? Specifically looking for the year, although if you also have the month, that's cool too. So when was the 1.0 version of Python released? That is your trivia question for the week. Now, another thing that, if you guys will kind of indulge me for a second on, is another kind of open letter, I guess. I know, I guess it was in the last episode, I had an open letter to the financial institutions that they need to get their acts together and get some real multi-factor authentication going and not just text messages or email codes. But this time, I want to give an open letter to the large website publications out there. Now, I understand why they do what they do. They make these ginormous articles filled with a bunch of word salad in order to improve their SEO, or their search engine optimization. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what search engine optimization is, in a nutshell, basically what it is a way that you can make your website look more appealing to search engines like DuckDuckGo, Google, Yahoo, Bing, whatever your search engine of choice is. Doing search engine optimization basically makes your website appeal more to them, so your website will appear higher in the rankings and in the search results. So the reason why these large websites throw so many combinations of keywords and phrases and other things that people would commonly search for is simply just to get higher in the search results, which if they get higher in the search results, that means more people theoretically will click on their website, which means more people will view all of the various ads on their website, which they're littered with. So more ads means more ad revenue, which means more money. So it's completely understandable why they do what they do. But my goodness, is it really annoying when you type something that should be a one-word answer or a one-number answer or a one-sentence tops answer, and you're met with paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of text, which have technically they have something to do with your answer, but they're not exactly what you're looking for. So then you scroll down like 10 paragraphs worth of text. Of course, during that time, you scroll through like at least 5 or so ads in the process. And then finally, near the bottom of the page, you actually see the answer that you're looking for. And that's on a good day. On a bad day, you scroll through the entire page, kind of skimming it because it's all a bunch of filler anyway, and nothing's helpful, so you just wasted your time. Now, there was actually one website that I did see in the past week that, like, in literally the first paragraph had the exact answer I was looking for, and I was like, thank you. Thank you for actually being helpful. Now, for me, this generally isn't that big of a deal because I have Pi-holes running, and I also use AdBlock unapologetically because I'm not about to scroll through all of your terrible ads that I do not want to see in order to just potentially have the option, or not even option, have the hope of finding what I'm looking for on your site. So for me, it's just a bunch of like empty white squares, like if I'm scrolling on mobile or if I'm actually on a computer, like through a desktop web browser, it's even less noticeable because the Pi-hole and then the ad blocker just either blocks everything out or essentially just makes it like a white square or something on the page, so I don't have to worry about seeing the ads. But for those out there that don't use solutions like Pi-hole or AdBlock, they have to sit through these ads, and my goodness, I honestly can't tell you how spoiled I've become using Pi-hole because I'll leave my house and forget to connect to my VPN back to my house, and I'll go on the internet and I'll be just absolutely bombarded with ads, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what the internet's like? And then I immediately turn on the VPN, refresh the page, and all the ads go away and things are all right in the world again. But yeah, so for those large website publishers out there, I get you're trying to make your money, but at the same time, I'm just trying to find an answer to my simple, super basic question, and I don't need to scroll through 10 paragraphs worth of useless information just to find the one word or one sentence response I was looking for. So hopefully you do something, but I kind of doubt you will because money's involved. Now, before we get into this week's cybersecurity tip, there was something that I think it was last week happened, but obviously since we didn't have an episode last week, I wanted to talk about it this week. And that is, I'm not sure if you guys heard, but the UK essentially wants to backdoor end-to-end encryption in order to better detect CSAM and other illegal activities going on in their country between their citizens. Now, if you care about security at all, which, seeing that you're listening to this podcast right now, I would assume you at least care somewhat about security, you're probably aware that, or you probably have the idea that backdooring end-to-end encryption and essentially giving you a way to break it, rendering it useless, is not a good idea. And it should also not come as a surprise that there was a lot of corporate backlash from the likes of Apple, WhatsApp, Signal, and a bunch of other corporate entities that are pretty mad about this and wrote letters, some quite extensive, in as less of words to say, if you go through with this, we're not going to support the UK anymore, and we're going to pull out. So obviously that's not good if you're from the UK. Apple went as far as even to say that they will remove services such as FaceTime and iMessage from the UK rather than weakening their security, which props to you, Apple. That I think that's a very good move. And I mean, it's not surprising that the UK is going through the route of CSAM and other illegal activities to try to shove this removal of privacy and security, because when you bring up the children and you bring up illegal activities, that's obviously something that you can get a lot of people to agree with you on. If you're saying we want to combat, child sex trafficking and we want to combat illegal activities, you're obviously going to have any person with a good conscience on your side. So if you can use that and twist it to then remove all, encryption and security and privacy, then you just open the door to be able to do whatever the heck you want. And in this case, with, like messaging apps like Signal, iMessage, WhatsApp, that kind of a thing, you now have access to every communication, of all of your citizens. And why do I say that? Well, there's this thing called the internet. And when you are sending messages through these messaging apps, they are going over the internet. Now, I think we kind of talked about in one of our episodes where we kind of did kind of a big deep dive into the internet. But basically, if you send a message on the internet to someone, your message does not go directly from your device to their device. There are multiple hops along the way that your packet has to go through in order to get to its destination. And this is where routers come into play, because routers is basically what, routes all the internet traffic around. So it's also what allows you to communicate to your friend that's on a completely different network, maybe even in a different country, and allows you to connect together by forwarding your packet along until it gets to its destination. Now, because there are so many routers and people in play, this allows for a lot of opportunities for man-in-the-middle attacks, which are essentially a way where an attacker sits between you and who you're trying to send your data to, intercepts that data, and then can basically do whatever they want with it, and then either forward it along unedited, or they can tamper with it and forward, a tampered version along. Now, this is a prime way that certain government organizations could use to harvest data of their users, because if they have access to a lot of the routers within the network of their country, they could quite trivially just essentially harvest all that data going through and do whatever they want with it. Now, with how much encryption is on the internet these days, they really can't do anything with that because it's all encrypted. Yeah, they have the data, but they don't have the keys in order to decrypt that data and actually see what's in the data. But if they backdoor encryption, they could see any, say, signal message that goes across. They could intercept that signal message, decrypt it because there's a backdoor, and see exactly what's being said in that message, and then they could then forward it on and essentially perform a man-in-the-middle attack on the entire country. Obviously, I don't think you need me to tell you why that's not a good idea. But yeah, something that is going around in the UK it hasn't been approved yet or anything like that yet, but it's definitely something that I wanted to bring up. So with that, talking about encryption, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, I kind of alluded to the fact of it being based on encryption, and that is that you should encrypt all sensitive data, obviously, and specifically all sensitive data you're sending through email. Now, there's the main way that there's actually a few ways that you can do this, and we'll touch on them. But the reason why you want to make sure that you encrypt any insensitive data is because there's a decent chance that sometime you may encounter a situation where you'll need to send someone something with sensitive information like personal contact information. There might be banking information on there. Whatever the sensitive info is, there might come a time where you'll have to send it somehow, and email might be one of, or if not, maybe even the only option. So you want to make sure that that data is being encrypted. Now, there's a couple ways that you can do this. The first way is to use email certificates. I'll have a link that Theo Joe, video Theo Joe made on how you can set this up. I have it set up for my personal email account. So I can send encrypted emails, assuming that the person I'm sending an email to also has a certificate, which is one of the downsides to the email certificate method. Is you and the person you're sending the email to have to have certificates on their email that allow you to not only sign the email but also encrypt the email. And in order to be able to encrypt an email, you have to exchange certs. So you essentially what that means is you have to send an email to someone with your with the email signed, and then with your certificate, and then they have to send you back an email signed with their certificate. And then once that happens, you've exchanged the certs, and then you can use the public key encryption scheme that's built into certificate-based email encryption, and then you can encrypt your emails that way. So there is a little bit of, I don't know if I want to say work involved, but there is. It's not like, a simple super plug and play option per se. But that is, assuming you have it set up, probably one of the easiest, because it's literally just a checkbox that you check when sending the email to encrypt it, and you're good to go. Another thing you could do is you could, assuming you have just your own personal public key, private key encryption scheme. So you're using like an RSA, you have your own RSA keys or whatever. Theoretically, another way you could do this was you could swap public keys with the person you're going to be sending your data through email with. And then you could just encrypt that data before you send it in the email, and then send it in the email. And then when they get it, they can decrypt it on their end. Now, obviously, another thing you could also do is you could layer these levels of encryption too. So you could, if you swapped public keys with the person you're trying to email, you could encrypt your email locally with your private key and their public key, and then you could put it in the email, encrypt the email, and send it to them, and then you essentially have an extra layer of encryption. And then the all else fails option, you could use a symmetric key encryption scheme, which basically just means it's the same key for encrypting and decrypting. But again, the thing here is you have to make sure that the person that you're sending the message to also has that same key in order to decrypt it. But you also have to be cautious of the fact of how you give them that key. Because if you don't give it to them either in an encrypted manner or just kind of like hand deliver it to them, there's the chance that someone could have intercepted that key and would theoretically be able to decrypt your message through some kind of man-in-the-middle attack. So it is something that you'd have to keep in mind, but there's multiple options that you can go through when it comes to encrypting sensitive data for emails. I've laid out a few here. So definitely something that you should be doing to keep your data secure and private. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So one thing we've also been talking about on the podcast is the Apple Vision Pro, because I've personally been quite interested in how Apple's going to do the whole like dev kit thing. Well, they have finally come out with applications for the dev kits that you can buy, or not buy, but receive. And surprise, surprise, there is a very, very, very limited number of them. And there is, of course, an application process. And as part of the application process, you have to be, a paid Apple developer. And you also have to provide a reason as to why you're requesting one. So you can't just apply for a development kit, you actually have to give a reason. So you'd have to be like you're porting, a Mac or an iOS app to the Vision Pro, or maybe you're making a brand new one and you have to, basically describe what the app's going to do, that kind of a thing. And essentially tell Apple why you need one of these dev kits and can't just use, the simulator that's built into Xcode. So also, Apple is apparently going to be doing checkups on you. So assuming that you're one of the lucky ones that can actually get one of these things, supposedly Apple is going to be knocking at your door every now and then, just checking in, making sure that you're following the NDA that you have to sign in order to get one of these things. Making sure that you're keeping it in a secure area and only those developers that actually need access to it have access to it, all that good stuff. And then, of course, they're not giving it to you for free. You will eventually have to return it, and they will come knocking for it if you don't, obviously. So, again, that's not really a surprise that they want it back. Plus, it would theoretically only be like an engineering sample, so it probably wouldn't necessarily be up to snuff to the final production units that come out whenever they do sometime next year. But just a heads up for any of you Apple developers out there that might want to try to get one of these developer kits. You can now apply to get one. I'll have a link to an article that 9to5Mac did with some more information on that also has the link that you can go down or go to apply for the developer kit for the Vision Pro. So with that, what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So, I guess this week or the past couple weeks, basically I was doing some more plumbing this week, specifically in regards to my memory leak issues, which are no more. Well, technically there's still one, but that has nothing to do with me, and I can prove it. And I will prove it. So I went through and I got all of the memory leak issues fixed. And I even went through the graphics because I knew graphics related there was going to be some memory leak issues. Because I don't remember if I mentioned in the last week or last episode or not, but there were some glaring issues of instances where I would malloc memory from the heap and never gave it back, which is memory leak 101 right there. Pretty glaring issue. That's an obvious memory leak. Now, I mentioned that there was one memory leak in particular that was not my fault that still exists. And this one specifically comes from GFL Winant. It's basically under the hood of my under the hood, essentially. It has to deal with like the graphics drivers and whatnot. It's part of calling the libx11 library. So when I say it's under the hood for my under the hood, for me, because as far as the graphics is concerned, I'm using a graphics library called Raylib. So for me, any of the graphics calls like that is under the hood and handled by Raylib. But this issue with this specific memory leak is even under the hood for Raylib. So we're a couple layers removed from the memory leak. And the reason why I was able to prove that this was indeed not my fault was because I ran my program, had the memory leak, whatnot, and then I basically took the basic Hello World example that Raylib has on their GitHub, compiled that, ran it, and got the exact same memory leak that I got in my version with the exact same stack trace and everything. So I knew that this wasn't an issue with my code, but rather something under the hood, which on the one hand is nice because this means that my code, the code that I wrote, is 100% leak-free. The bad news is it's still technically not leak-free, but at the same time, there's nothing I can do about that. But then the other good news is that because it's not something that I did, that means that whenever or if ever this issue would get fixed, my program would then see the benefit of that. So there's that too. And there were... So I guess one thing when it comes to the graphics section that I was talking about, potentially having or definitely having memory leaks, kind of the ironic thing about it was the memory leaks that existed, technically speaking, had nothing to do with graphics at all. And it was specifically with how I was reading in essentially objects in order to represent them in the graphics. So how I'm doing objects currently is I essentially have two different map files. I have the GUI map file, which has like all of the images and the textures on it. And then I essentially have a glorified text file, which basically maps all of the various objects, what they are. Are they buildings? Are they signs? Are they NPCs? Are they, warp tiles? Basically what the object is and its coordinates. And then some other information as well. And basically where the memory leak was coming from was in reading that data and parsing it and processing it was basically where my memory leak was. And of course, as I mentioned, it was largely from not freeing the memory that I allocated to myself. So basically a rookie mistake right there. But now that my code is finally leak-free, I can actually move on to some more fun and enjoyable things rather than tracking down leaks. Of course, though, since my code is now leak-free, I obviously want to try to keep it that way, so I will be doing incremental checks and whatnot to make sure that it still remains leak-free. But because we've had 2 weeks worth of nerdy things, I was able to implement some additional features into this game. I mentioned that I can move on to the fun stuff now. So I implemented another constructor for just the generic stripped down version of my Pokemon class. And this is, I think, going to be a huge win because basically what this can do is it can take in a dex number and a level and construct the Pokemon that way. Since before, the only way to make one was to just create like a default one with like the default constructor and manually set everything. That was one way. The second way is you'd already have a Pokemon created, which obviously that doesn't really do you much good since you have to create one in the first place. So it is what it is. And then the other version was you would create a Pokemon from the bigger, beefier Pokemon class that has more information that I don't necessarily need for every individual, Pokemon object that's going to be moved around because I can just pull from a global data structure. So because of that, this new version is probably going to end up being my main constructor that I use for basically all the calls. So I was very happy to get that implemented and working, and that was definitely a big win. Another thing, we're just going to be hitting we got a lot of nerdy stuff to cover, obviously 2 weeks. Granted, I didn't do some stuff for a while when I had a bug because I had to fix that bug before I could do some more actual, life stuff. So another thing I did was, this was actually something I've been kind of wanting to do for a while, which was create Docker containers for my websites. They're super basic. It's basically I just pull down an Nginx container, which is basically a basic web server type thing. Basically pull down an Nginx container, threw my website in there, and that's it. So super basic, no kind of like certificate stuff going on in there, nothing like that, just super basic. But the main reason I wanted to do this was because I figured this would be a pretty good way for me to test and experiment with CI/CD pipelines which is something that I really want to try to learn more about and get into. So my goal here is, now that I have this Docker container that I can create for my websites, my goal is to try to set up some kind of CI/CD pipeline that when I push a git change and commit the change, it'll go into Git and basically run through this pipeline and then automatically deploy my website as a Docker container on some server in my home lab. And I just want to try to see that working, and that would be a ginormous win if I can get that working. So that's something that I'm planning on doing eventually at some point. Not exactly sure when that'll happen, but that is what my future plan for that is. And then another thing that I did, like I said, we're just running through these. I created a little script to auto-compare checksums or hashes of files. Now, this is an interesting story of why I did this, because I was navigating around my NAS and I realized I had two folders with the same files, and they were encrypted archive folders. So rather than be decrypting each one of them and manually comparing all the contents in there, I was like, I'm just going to take a cryptographic hash of these things and see if they're the same or not. So basically, I guess first we should briefly cover what I'm talking about. So if you're unfamiliar with a hash or a cryptographic hash, basically a cryptographic hash is it's essentially a checksum, or a way that you can determine if a file has been altered or not. So specifically, I use the SHA-256 cryptographic hash function, which I'm pretty sure is on most. I'm not sure if it's like enabled out of the box on Windows, but I know on like Mac OS and Linux, it's pretty easy to do a SHA-256 hash. But basically, what it is it's a secure. It's basically man, I cannot talk right now. It's a secure way to make sure that there were no malicious changes made to a file. So in layman's terms, what that means is if you run in this case, a SHA-256 hash on a text document that reads hello world, if you then go into that text document and add an extra space in between hello and world, and you run the SHA-256 hash on it, you're going to get a completely different hash result from that, because you made a change to it. So obviously that's a super basic example, but the point being is that it's an easy way that you can tell if two files are the same or if a file has been tampered with. And these are actually super beneficial if you're delivering software and you're hosting software on a website, because this will give people using and downloading your software a way to verify that the software that they actually download on their machine wasn't intercepted by a man-in-the-middle attack and potentially tampered with, because they can run a checksum on the file they download, and if it matches the checksum that you provide on your website, then they know that the file is indeed the same one that you posted and they downloaded, and they can verify that it's legit. So there is definitely utility there. So that's part of the reason why I use that, to make sure that these files were the same. Now, obviously, rather than taking maybe like 10, 15 minutes to manually run these checksums on each of the files and compare them manually. Of course, you guys know me. I had to spend like at least a couple hours writing a Python script in order to automate this for me and do it all, so I don't actually have to do any manual check myself, because doing all that manual work myself of comparing them is obviously peasant work, and I can't be bothered with that. So I, of course, had to make a script to automate this process, which I did. And of course, yes, the folders actually didn't end up being the exact same, so then I was able to go and delete the one that I didn't want. So all of that work just to tell myself, or to verify that the folders and files were the same. And the last thing that I'll touch on, which is kind of what I want to lead into a larger topic of conversation, is something I did on my GitHub, which is I set up verified commits. So my commits are now verified on GitHub. So not to flex too hard or anything, which actually it's really not saying that much, and it's pretty easy to do. Basically, all you have to do is upload a public GPG key that you can then sign your commits with, the private key, and then every time that you push a commit that was signed with your private GPG key to your GitHub, it'll show up as a verified commit. So pretty easy to do. Honestly, something I probably should have set up a while ago. Another thing I should have set up a while ago was an SSH key, so I could more easily push and pull without having to get like a special token from GitHub in order to authenticate myself. So, which is also something I did, but which is something that was definitely way overdue. But the other thing I did too was I wrote another script to auto-initialize any Git repository to reproduce and automatically verify these commit messages. Because in order to sign a commit message, you have to pass like a flag for it, or you can just manually add a line in your git config file in order to do it automatically for you. Now, I hear some of you saying, why don't I just set the global config values so I only ever had to set this up once rather than going through the headache, and well, not necessarily headache, but going through the process of writing a script and having to run that script every time I want to push, to my GitHub. And that's actually a really good question, because if you're asking that question, your head's in the right spot and you're thinking the right way. Because yes, that is definitely the ideal solution. The problem is I push to more than one Git location on my personal devices rather than just to my GitHub. So I have a local GitLab server running at my house in my home lab that I push code to. I have a GitLab account on GitHub's website that I will push code to sometimes. All those, I don't think I have any like public repos there though. But needless to say, I have other repos aside from my GitHub that I push code to. And honestly, I'd argue that GitHub probably isn't my primary place that I push my Git code to. It's not the primary place I push code to. And that's partly because all that's public, and that's kind of like my public portfolio, if you will. So I really only push projects there that I think are, one, worth it to push there. Like, I'm not going to... The script that I wrote to auto-initialize the Git repo for GitHub, yeah, it's in version control, but I'm not going to push that to GitHub because who cares, right? Like, that's not that big of a thing to push there. Other things like that checksum script I wrote, I mean, it's just kind of like a little personal mini script that I wrote. It's just kind of like a tool that I wrote for myself. Like, not everything that I push needs to be, public knowledge, right? But because I push to other Git repos, I can't exactly necessarily set up a global one to be one of the lesser used ones. Like, if I'm going to set my global Git config, I'm going to set it to the thing that I push to the most, which personally right now is probably my self-hosted GitLab instance because of all the various personal projects I've been working on. A lot of code action being pushed there. Like, if you look at my Git history on there, it's pretty poppin'. My timeline thing there is very colorful. But I guess that is one thing that we kind of should get into, is this idea of our personal projects and projects that you make for yourself that you don't push to, say, a public GitHub repo or a public GitLab repo or a public Bitbucket repo or any other public Git repo. Are those kinds of personal projects closed source software? Personally, I would argue no. Some might argue yes, because the source code for said projects is not public and therefore it is closed source. And if that's what you think, then you are technically correct, right? Like all of my Ansible playbooks, right, that I use to administer my home lab and my infrastructure, none of those are on my GitHub or any platform that is open to the public to view. So yes, technically, those are closed source. My Pokemon project that I'm talking about, that I'm constantly talking about and working on, technically, yes, that is closed source. If you're going by the argument that because the code is not open currently and available for everyone to view, it is therefore closed source. If you're going by that argument, then yes, personal projects that you don't release are therefore closed source. So you could potentially make the argument that I'm being pretty anti-open source now, seeing that I have personal projects that I host myself that aren't, viewable to the public. But here's where I would make the counter argument to that. And the counter argument is the GPL. And you might be wondering what that has to do with anything. And obviously, I'm no lawyer, so don't take this as legal advice by any means. But the GPL allows you to, it basically says that you have to release the source code, right? But at the same time, it also allows for a company like Red Hat to essentially block off access to their source code, but still be in line with the GPL. And how does that work? Because those people that actually get access to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, like the ISOs, through the customer portal, are paying customers and then get access to the source code. So from my understanding of how the GPL works and other related open source licenses, as long as the users of your software have access to the source code, it is open source and therefore is in line with the GPL. So if I write a personal project for myself that only I ever use, technically speaking, by that logic, it is open source because I have access to the source code and I'm the only person using it and I'm not distributing it at all. Now, if I were to go ahead and distribute that project and I didn't also make the source code available, then it would be closed source. But if I gave that software away and also then went and turned around and posted, the repo on my GitHub, for example, then it would be open source. So technically, as far as I'm concerned, the only time where closed source and open source really matters at all is if you're dealing with software that's being released and being used by people that essentially aren't you. Now, I guess you could technically make the argument that if you, wrote a really cool program or something that you wanted to give to one of your friends, if you gave it to them and didn't also give them the source code, you could potentially make the argument that it's closed source, although you would have to be kind of careful on that one, just because if they'd never ask for the source code, then, what are you going to do? But if they do ask for the source code and you give it to them, technically you're open source at that point. So it's kind of a legalese argument, I guess you could say, or where do you draw the line? But from my point of view, if you don't release the project, you don't release the software, or have no plans on ever releasing the software, then it doesn't matter whether you want to call it open source or closed source, because you're never releasing it, which is why you're allowed, per the GPL, to download, a GPL library or code that's licensed under the GPL and use it for personal use and never release that code anywhere. Because, again, you're using it for personal use, you're not releasing it for anyone to use, so therefore you don't have to open source your code as per the GPL license, which, if you're unaware, the GPL license basically acts like a virus in the sense that if you download a project that is licensed under the GPL and you plan to release your project, you then have to license it under the GPL in order to comply with the GPL. But if you only keep that for yourself and never plan on releasing it, that never becomes an issue. So this kind of goes back to, what I said earlier, where the idea of something being open source or closed source really doesn't matter until you're actually at the point where you're going to release the software to the public. Now, if you look at my actual GitHub, you'll see there's a decent number of actual projects on there of like software that's like I would consider decently usable and potentially valuable, that to more than just me as a single person. And another good example that I have of instances like this where I would, write software as a personal project, not release it, but also release it is, if you'll back a couple months ago, I wrote a couple programs. One was a server that would basically tell me how much time I had left in grad school, and the other one was various versions of clients that could run on macOS, Linux, Windows, iOS, that would allow me to reach out to that server and get essentially a real-time countdown of how much time I had left. Now, obviously, I don't think that is a very valuable tool to your average Joe, right? I don't think your average software developer, average person looking for software is going to really care about that, which is part of the reason why I didn't release it. The other part of why I didn't release it was a personal project that I wrote for myself. I didn't write it for everyone. Now, I went and took that code, modified it, and released it to everyone under the Universal Countdown program that I put on my GitHub, which basically is the exact same thing, but makes it configurable and strips out everything grad school related and allows you to configure with whatever occasion you want and with whatever date and time you want, which obviously is a lot more usable to your normal person out there. So basically for me, when it comes to what's a personal project that I keep for myself and I only use internally and don't plan on ever releasing to people, versus projects like that Universal Countdown thing that I made, like the logging library I talked about, in the past episode, like my Server Connect program that I wrote that allows me to easily connect to all my servers by just a name rather than having to have and manage an SSH config file, like the CPU benchmark API that I wrote. So many different projects that I wrote for myself because I wanted to use them personally, but then I also realized that these actually have some utility that I think other people might also want to use, in which time I decided to push into my GitHub and release them for everyone. And then any development that I do for those projects, I just push directly to my GitHub, so that anyone can freely download and use to their heart's content, and made them all, completely open source. So I do obviously value the idea of open source. But the other thing of it too is some of the personal projects that I work on potentially could harm my privacy and my overall security. And that goes back to my Ansible playbooks. I mentioned them a little earlier. And it's not because I'm storing plain text passwords in there, although I'm going to admit something very shameful. At one point, I did have plain text passwords in there, but there are no longer any plain text passwords in there, so we're all good. But the reason I don't open source that is for a couple of reasons. The first being they're for myself, right? Like I wrote them for myself for my specific use case. They're not, there's like maybe one of them that could potentially be seen as like a generic Ansible playbook. But even still on that, it's still kind of sort of customized and tailored for my specific use case. So things that are like tailored for my specific use case, generally, in my opinion, don't exactly make for the best things to be released to the public, because if you're going to release something to everyone, in my opinion, it should be able to be used by everyone. Maybe, yeah, sure, maybe you need like a config file, but anyone should be able to use it. It shouldn't be tailored specifically for one person's use case, which is what a lot of, some of the personal projects that I do are. And another thing too with the Ansible playbooks as well is it reveals a lot about my home infrastructure. Like, it reveals a lot. Because if you're familiar with Ansible and how Ansible playbooks work, you generally have what's called an Ansible inventory file, which has like all the various hosts you're trying to connect to, and you can group them together based on various naming conventions, and you have things like either domain names or IP addresses in there. So if that got out, someone would basically have a very easy time to figure out exactly where everything is on my network, which obviously that is a security concern, obviously. Now, you could make the argument that I could just, put that in the git ignore and it wouldn't be included in the repository, and that is a very fair point you make there. But part of the issue I have with that is the fact that if I'm spinning up a new device, like maybe I get a new laptop or a new desktop or whatever, or I wipe the drive on a machine that I have and reinstall the operating system and I need my Ansible configs back, I don't have that inventory file now because I can't just clone the repository and have that there. So it's partly a convenience factor, so I don't have to manually re-enter all that information. So there's that. Plus, the other thing too that I guess it probably shouldn't go without saying is Microsoft owns GitHub too. Now, theoretically, I could push all my code to some other remote Git repo. Like I said, I have a GitLab account, like with actual GitLab in addition to my self-hosted instance. So theoretically, I could push to there too. But I don't, for my GitHub specifically, Microsoft doesn't need to be snooping on every little coding project that I work on, especially the personal ones, because part of the reason initially that I created a GitLab account on GitLab.com was because at the time, GitHub either didn't allow you to have private repos or they had that locked behind a paywall. I don't remember which it was at the time, but regardless, I didn't have access to it. And there were things that I wanted to put in source control, like, various personal projects, for example, but I didn't want them as public-facing repos for various reasons that I have mentioned throughout the course of this episode. So that's why I mainly have the GitLab. Although, since I spun up my own self-hosted instance of GitLab, I honestly very rarely actually use my GitLab account on, the actual GitLab site. Because most of the time, if I want to push something that I don't want everyone to see, and it's just a personal project that I did because I wanted to tinker with something, or just a miscellaneous script or something, or whatever the case may be, I just push it to my self-hosted instance because I control all of that. I know where that source code is. I know who has access to it, and there's going to be no funny business from anyone snooping or tampering with it. So basically, the TLDR of this, or I guess the TLDL, because you didn't read it, you didn't listen. Basically, software can't be closed source if you never release it. So if you are writing a personal project for yourself that you don't plan on ever giving to anyone else, obviously your reasons can vary. It can be have personal, information about you or your network or whatever. It could just be a basic test program that you're trying to tinker with something to figure something out. Whatever the case may be, if you're never planning on releasing it, the idea of it being closed source can't even be brought up because it's not even part of the discussion. And it's only closed source if you release the project for people to use and then don't provide them the source code. Per instance, like the GPL, that would be a violation of the GPL, where if you would release the source, you would release the software for people to use, but then not also give them access to the source code. That is something that would be considered closed source. So essentially, think of it like this. If you have access to the software, then you must also have access to the source code for that software in order for it to be considered open source. So if you have access to the software, but you do not have access to the software's source code, then that software is closed source or proprietary. But if you have access to that software and you have access to that software's source code, then it is considered to be open source, which is how folks, like I mentioned earlier, Red Hat can get away with making you have to pay for their software, but also still falling in line with the GPL. And being considered open source, because the idea of being open source has nothing to do with whether the software is free or not. It has everything to do with if you have access to the software and use it, you also have access to the source code that created said software. So another way to think of it is there's a reason that Alice is able to use the GPL, a GPL licensed repo in her personal project that she never releases, and that's not an issue. But Bob, on the other hand, if he used that same repo in a project that he was releasing the software for, he would be in violation of, because he wasn't also giving them the source code. And it wouldn't matter if Bob was charging people for that software or he was giving it away for free. But because he was using GPL licensed code in his software, and then when he was releasing the software wasn't also providing the source code for everyone that uses the software, he is then in violation of the GPL. And of course, all this GPL talk, again, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take any of it as legal advice. But at the end of the day, in terms of open source and closed source or proprietary code, it only applies to released software. So software that you obtain or use, whether it was free or you bought it through a license or a subscription, if you use software and you can have access to the source code, then it is open source. So no, you don't have to worry if you are making personal projects. At least in my opinion, you don't have to worry about going against the principles of open source if you make a personal project and then don't release it to anyone. Because, like I said, if you don't release it, then all of this is kind of null and void anyway, and we're just talking into the wind for no reason. So to those who say that personal projects are closed source because the source code isn't open, I guess technically you're right, but at the same time, you're basically making in my opinion anyway, you're making a void argument, because at the same time, you could argue with the same logic, yeah, the source code's not open, but then again, no one has access to the software except me, and I also have access to the source code. So therefore, by that argument, it's also open source. Obviously, I don't think anyone would realistically make that argument, but if you're using the logic that the source code isn't publicly available, I would obviously counter you with, well, neither is the software itself, and no one can use it except for me, but I have access to the source code, therefore making it open source. But again, I wouldn't make that argument. Because again, it comes down to the fact that is the software released for people to use? If it is, then we can talk about whether it's open source or not. If it's not released for everyone to use, there really isn't much of a discussion. So that's kind of the debate that I see when it comes to personal projects versus closed source. So with that, speaking of programming and whatnot, let's get back to this week's trivia question, which is about Python. So when was the 1.0 version of Python released? If you said January of 1994, then congratulations, you are correct. And honestly, when I, was doing research for the trivia question this week, when I saw that, I kind of had to do a double take, because I was like, wait, Python's been around that long? I didn't realize Python was that old. Funny story here, Python is older than Google. So let that sink in for a little bit. And when I say let that sink in, I'm not talking about, like that sink that Elon brought into Twitter HQ. I mean, you could obviously let those sinks in too, but just this idea that Python is older than Google, which is weird, because when a lot of the younger crowd thinks of Google, they think that Google's been around since, the dawn of man, since the beginning of time. And if you're older than Google, like some of us old farts recording podcasts are, then, I mean, we're just ancient, right? Like, all of you listeners that are older than Google, you're ancient, according to some people. But Python is apparently ancient, coming out in 1994. So if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member, like you guys are really killing it out there doing, so keep it up. If you have any questions about this episode, or you have topics or comments for future episodes, you can shoot me a question at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There is a link, of course, as always, down in the show notes below for that. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.